teachers of Reddit, what student will you never forget? One of my students told me as a child she wanted to grow up to be a strawberry and then cried when she realized she couldn't because she was a human being. Very sweet girl. I've had many students that are still taking a large place in my heart. Some are sad, like the girl whose mother started beating her during a parent conference. I started crying and begged the mother to stop. The student who had no water or electricity at home, but we allowed him to shower at school and we washed his clothes. The student who watched his grandparents get murdered by his mother and wrote about it in an essay for my class. The student who had never been in a lake that we took camping. He was so excited but didn't know how to swim, so he just stood in the water up to his neck and grinned. Lovely. The girl with terrible anxiety that I sat with for hours after school to work on schoolwork. Not because she wasn't smart, but because she was so anxious about not being perfect. The girl who was mauled by a dog with a messed up face, but she always smiled. The girl whose father brought her to school every day late who finally broke down and told me her father was raping her every day when the mother left to go to work. The Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees who flooded my school after the war. One wrote an essay about running towards a boat and seeing his grandfather get shot, but he had to keep running. The Brazilian boy who got up in class and got me to start dancing with him while we all laughed joyfully. The group of students I took outside during their first snowstorm. The wonder on their faces was priceless. The student who found me on Facebook after 20 years to tell me I made a difference in her life. She came to my state and took me to dinner and told me I was there for her when her home life was terrible. I had no idea. I'm just kind to everyone. I have a million more stories. I have loved every student, and being able to teach has been an honor. I taught math to 5th 8th graders. Had a student who did very well. Always pleasant. Helped others, etc. I began to think about him more when I noticed a pattern in the clothes he wore. The clothes were nice, basic, and clean, so I really just shrugged it off. It had just turned into the holiday season that year, about a week or so before Thanksgiving. And one evening I had to run back to the school to pick up my car as I had went out with some fellow instructors. As I was preparing to leave I noticed activity near the dumpsters and saw him digging through them pulling out food scraps from the cafeteria. My heart sank about 1,000 feet. I didn't know what to do if I were to go up to him. He'd know I knew, and I just didn't know how he would react. I talked with a colleague of mine who knew a social worker. The family had suffered the loss of his dad about 2 years ago, and now his mom was battling cancer. To say they were hanging on by a thread would be an understatement. But the kid hid this from everyone as far as we knew. Finally, we knew we had to do something. So we all waited one evening and sure enough, he returned. He was scared, ashamed, crying, angry, every emotion you can think of. I do not blame him. We took him to his home, and his mom was emotional too. We ordered hot food and a colleague went and got it, and we all spent many hours that evening talking and reassuring them we were there to help. Working with local resources, we got them the help they needed. Food, medical assistance, even local volunteers to come help with some chores around their house. The mom got better thankfully, and the bright young man continued to do well in school and got a scholarship for college when he graduated a few years later. This was 20 years ago today. That bright young man works as a mechanical engineer and is still as generous and considerate as ever. His mother, sadly, passed on around 10 years ago. All 3 of his former teachers from that night went to the funeral. I'm very proud of him. We still keep in touch and visit often. I was a water sports instructor teaching people kayaking and canoeing a couple years back. There was a group of refugees, all minors between 11 to 17 that came to us through a charity that was supporting them gaining asylum in my country, UK. All of them had crossed the channel on a raft or dinghy literally 2 days before. And for some goddamn reason the charity had decided it was a good time to take them canoeing. Can't make this shit up. There was this one kid from South Sudan, 15 years old and an absolute behemoth. We are talking 6 foot plus and pushing 14 to 15 stone in weight. Covered in scars, some of them ritualistic scarification, missing teeth and generally just looking like he'd been through hell many times. He was terrified of the water I took him in my boat. Nice and easy. Then once he got comfortable, I just stuck a stern rudder in and let him power us through the water. Him and the other kids loved it. We had some tears at the beginning. I imagine there was a lot of PTSD involved, judging by the state of some of these poor kids. At the end of the session, this giant monster of a child walked up to me with a huge jagged grin, said in broken English, "Thank you, leader," and gave me a bear hug I'll never forget. To this day, 4 years later, I still remember that grin. So many. Madison, who had a beautiful smile. A few years after graduation, she was murdered by her boyfriend, a classmate of hers. This shattered me. Tony, who had and I seated right in front of me. He made me crazy and charmed his way into my heart both at the same time. He liked my class but not science, and that was fine. Travis, who was a nice kid in school but is now a real leader in his community. Stephanie, who pursued a career in chemistry and said it was because I inspired her. Sarah, who called me the night she was suicidal. She's now one semester from being a social worker. Dustin, from my first year, who was living on his own and needed lunch money half the time. He's a dad and husband now and doing great. Hallie, who put a ton of pressure on herself and was in tears in my class after school. A couple conversations with her dad later, and I think maybe a family crisis was averted. She's with the Peace Corps now. Bill, who did as much as needed to make a C in my class, and no more, who has a PhD in mathematics and is a data scientist. He was bored. M, whose name is distinct, so I'm only using his initial. Blew off school from January to March for unknown reasons. Kicked it into high gear for the last quarter and final, but still ended with a 59. F. It cost me nothing to nudge that to a 60, so he could have the credit and graduate. He knew, and thanked me. Kids doing well now. Justin, who had a major falling out with a journalism teacher and couldn't get anybody to listen to his side of things. He teed for me during that double period after dropping her class. He's a dad and successful reporter. Super nice guy. It's not that these are any more or less remarkable than anyone else. We just forged a relationship, and I'm so grateful to have shared a small bit of their lives. The thing I miss most about being in the classroom is the kids. I had a 7th grader that was the biggest, happiest doofus. He actually was pretty intelligent, but he was such an open book and didn't put much effort into school that he came across as a bit of a fool. Other teachers treated him like a nuisance because he definitely was a distraction to other kids. He didn't try to be disruptive, he just was. But he lit up the room with positive energy and was genuinely happy to enjoy every moment of being alive. I didn't understand how his prior teachers were annoyed by him because he genuinely was a ray of sunshine and he made everyone a little happier by being in his presence. He was always smiling, always entertained by life, and it was contagious. Kind of like a human golden retriever. I helped him learn how to set school-related goals for himself and take more of an interest in the things we studied. And he was so proud of earning his first A in my class. The reason I will never forget him is because I wasn't yet a mother when I taught him. And I decided then that if I ever have kids, I hope they will as happy as Oscar is. I would try to encourage their sense of wonder and fun. Above all else. I had a junior, 16 years old, in my high school science course last year peel the strip of metal off the side of a ruler and proceed to stick each end of it into an outlet and electrocute himself. I saw the sparks out of the corner of my eye and he jumped up and his arm was in some significant pain. He said he did it because he wanted to see what would happen. Scientific method in action, I guess. I will never forget that Dumbus. I will never forget Michael. He came from a different country at the age of 2. It took him months to open up to me, but I was patient with him, and it paid off. We had an unbreakable bond. We would do our projects together. We would play. I learned his native language so I could better communicate with him. He opened a new level of love and joy into my life. At my school, we get a lot of refugees from the Middle East and South Asia. I had a student, Iraqi, talk to me about her trip over. They fled when IS was starting to take over their city. Her father stayed behind to help others get out. They got a notice that he was being held ransom a few days later. They paid the ransom, and in return, was sent an image of his headless body. She was an incredibly happy, jovial young woman. I can't even imagine what kid of pain she must have went through. I heard many stories of fleeing war and strife, but that one was probably the worst for me. My old philosophy professor told me that, out of all of his thousands of students, I would be the one he'd never forget, which was pretty nice to hear. He then told me it was because I was the one that made him lose faith in humanity. But hey, win some lose some. As a teacher, I have to admit that in large classes, the good students often get forgotten about. The simple fact is that the bad students take a lot more effort than those students who just innately understand the information I'm teaching. If I'm teaching a smaller class, the opposite is true. I notice the good students because they are good, and the bad students because they need more help. That said, when a student is extremely exceptional, I take notice. I had a student named Redacted who was the most exceptional student I've ever had. She not only aced literally every assignment I ever handed out, but she also got perfects on every test. Now, it's normal to have very good students who do very well, high as on every test, but not perfect scores. However, it wasn't just because she was intelligent. She was one of those students who came in regularly for help with homework. That said, she rarely had anything wrong. She just wanted confirmation that her thinking was correct. To this day I still use her lab reports as examples of how to write a lab report. Apostrophe. The most exciting thing for me, as a professor of science, is students who show the initiative of thinking outside the box. Science isn't about memorizing things. It's not really about the math, although that is how we test in the sciences. Science is about learning to ask the right questions. If you know how to ask the right questions, then you will make a great scientist because, believe it or not, figuring out which experiments to do is much more difficult than doing the experiments. When students ask the right questions, I get excited. Oftentimes, depending on the level of class, the right questions can be simple. Something like if A is true and B is true, does that mean C is also true? That may seem silly to you and me, but the younger students I teach don't really think like that yet. They haven't learned to think critically. Thinking critically is taking what you know and asking questions that are plausible, then taking the answers to those questions, if those answers exist, and modifying your questions. I'm a professor, and I had a student who was a big dude, much older than the typical college student, like maybe 40, ex-military, and very stoic. We did a simulation exercise during class where students had to make a decision about whether to race a car or withdraw from the race. Most students go forward with the race for a variety of reasons, but what they don't know is that this situation mirrors the decision that NASA made with the Challenger launch, which obviously exploded. After the exercise, the student came up to me and started crying and said it was the most impactful exercise has ever done, and that when I have hard days I should remember that I made a difference for him. I almost started crying myself. It was a great moment in my career. Not a teacher, but when I was in the 8th grade we had a little buddy in kindergarten where we accompanied them to church. It was a Catholic school, and also did learning/fun activities with them a few days of the week for a period. I got this little blonde-haired kid with glasses named Jess, and he was quite the handful. He didn't really seem to get along with the other kids, and was always acting out. At first he was tough to try and keep in line, especially at church. But after a while he seemed to take a real liking to me and started listening. We started getting along great and had a lot of fun drawing/coloring and reading together. One day I got to meet his mom before school started. She handed me a present. It was the latest Harry Potter book and thanked me for being such a great buddy to Jess. Apparently his dad left them and he took it really hard, which was why he was always acting out. She said that she noticed a change and thinks that me being so nice to him had a lot to do with it because he would talk about me to her. I taught sculpture and mask making at an arts summer camp years back. One of the projects was drawing a creature and then carving a 3D version of it out of a block of foam to paint and decorate. All the students nailed it, except one. A boy around 9 didn't get it. I sat with him and went over it many times. He didn't understand the concept of 3 dimensions. Like, what would this side view look like as a top view? Type thinking. After a long while, my assistant, a woman in her late 30s, took me aside and pointed out all the indicators that the kid had fetal alcohol syndrome. I had no idea. I'll never forget his confused, blank face and my frustration at how someone couldn't think in 3D. I try to be more understanding, sympathetic and patient now. When I was student teaching English classes, I had this one girl who completely lied and obviously spark noted the plot for Lord of the Flies. She would clearly cheat with it on the test, but for some reason made the mistake of thinking Peggy's name was Peggy, and I will never forget her page-long essay about how Peggy was the only girl on the island and the BS plot points she added to go with it. I nearly died when I was grading it. Not a memorable student, but a hilarious janitor. I was a sub at an elementary school one year. There had been an incident next door where a kid picked his nose until it bled. And did it ever bleed? The teacher sent the boy to the nurse, which was at the other end of the school. I walked out of the classroom during my break period to see the bright red splotches of blood going all the way to the end of a long hallway and around the corner. As I rounded the corner, the janitor was at the other end of that next long hallway with a mop. He looked up at me and made a shush signal, then loudly whispered, "I'm tracking deer." I have lots of good stories, but my most memorable was a bad one which, while unfortunate, had an outcome I'm most proud of. There was a student in the school that was really smart, but one of the most hateful pieces of garbage I had ever seen. One look at his home life showed where he got this. I don't think of it as an excuse, however, because the person that he acted most like he also hated the most. He was racist, sexist, many phobias, and just downright cruel. Unfortunately, we lived in a place that types of racism was accepted. For example, I asked him how he was doing one day, and he said, "I feel worked like a black guy," and other people just laughed. Very anti-Muslim, and had no problems calling them all terrorists in the middle of class, etc. On top of this, he was quite a piece of work outside of school, and had multiple run-ins with different students. This student always wanted to be in the military, going so far as claiming he worked with special forces over the summer break one year when he was a minor. The school would try and ask him what else he wanted to do, and they didn't want a backup plan, only military. The day came, and he officially applied to the armed forces of our country. He went around to other teachers. I wasn't asked, and despite them telling the student they would be completely honest, which wouldn't make him look good, he still put them down as references. I called the local recruiting office. Now in our history we have multiple events of soldier cruelty to the locals. Most military forces do, but some of ours were so serious they required political intervention. When I spoke to the recruiting officer, I laid out my concerns by stating the student's background, and then said specifically, "If you accept this person into your organization, I can virtually guarantee that you will have a similar scandal to event name, and people who don't look like him will be dead." After a long conversation, the recruiter got a little more interested and contacted the student's references. The references did what they said they would. They were honest and told him this is one of the most sexist, racist and homophobic people they had ever taught, and they don't want to recommend him. The student was rejected from the forces. He then went on to be charged with uttering threats for brandishing a weapon against people in a workplace. It may not be a happy story. Thankfully I have lots of those too, but this is one of the ones that make me the most proud, because we saw his potential and actually stepped up and did something about it. I can't help but feel bad for everyone in this story. It is rare I would feel bad for a sexist, racist, homophobe getting checked, but to lose out on your only life plan due to being raised by terrible people is just so sad. I imagine one's life doesn't take a positive trajectory after getting that rejection. Detention live equals so named because that's how I addressed her and her inability to not disrupt class. I'm still very close to her and communicate with her weekly. One of my fave kids. The Babble Boys equals a group of 6 boys. Very smart and very talkative. They would discuss in class all sorts of interesting things and totally distract everyone. I love them, and they made me 10x the teacher I would have been without them. Their curiosity was infectious. I have been to their weddings and to their children's baptisms. Miriam equals because I failed her. I could not stop her from taking her own life. I will never forgive myself for it. The council equals 3 girls and 1 boy who all became lawyers and won a doctorate in linguistics on my debate team. Hilarious. Powerful. Bright. Chance equals I tried so hard to get through to you. I bought you books on rapping and rhymes. I bought you food. I tried to get you to a safer place. I failed you too. I hope you are safe. I still worry about you. Kelly equals my yearbook editor. She held my inexperienced hand as my first editor and cried with me in the stairwell. I'm proud of her. I'm proud of us. The unnamed boy who threw a desk at my head. I'm trying to forgive you for making me fearful of students. It is hard. I'm human. I'm still afraid of you. I still see you around. 14 years in the business. We need to pay teachers more. We need to honor them more. This year may break me. If you enjoy watching these videos, make sure to hit the subscribe button and like this video. Thanks.